The land of Iran, today stretching from the Caspian Sea in the north to the Persian Gulf in the south, bordered by Iraq in the west, Afghanistan and Pakistan in the east. A land of deserts, lush forests, low-lying coastal regions, and the towering Zagros Mountains, a region of magnificent, ancient and living monuments. Its main language, Persian, one of the greatest literary traditions of the world, and home to over 5,000 years of exquisite, rich, vibrant material culture. This is Epic Iran. Epic Iran at the V&A is the first UK show in 90 years to explore 5,000 years of Iranian art, design and culture.
The key purpose of the exhibition is to give a higher profile to Iran as one of the great civilisations of Asia. And it's a great civilisation that very few people know about.
It has an unbroken tradition and production of culture at the highest level over many, many centuries, thousands of years. And what is really important to show is that this continues today.
The exhibition evokes the physical as well as the material experience of Iran. Starting in around 3000 BC, the broad curve of earth-colored blocks suggests the first cities built on the dry Iranian plateau. It then moves into a space of majesty, evoking the hall of columns at Persepolis, the palace at the heart of the great Persian Empire. It moves through to the coming of Islam, which brought about an explosion of learning, craftsmanship, and creativity in every form of object, from the humble through to royal patronage, and on to Iran's magnificent architecture, epitomized by the domes of the mosques at Esfahan, in which the V&A has built on a scale never seen at the museum before. And finally, it ends in the white walls of the modern gallery with the contemporary art of Iran today.
For most places in the world, and especially other civilizations in Asia, it would seem a bit basic to do such an exhibition that covers such a huge period. But we think that this exhibition is necessary because we have to put back together again what has been sundered by the way Iran's been treated.
Academic study and museum displays have all tended to separate Iran's ancient archaeological past from the art of its Islamic age, and no exhibition in the UK has brought the two together and then taken the story into the 21st century. Epic Iran reveals that there are threads that run throughout Iran's cultural history, periods where, despite upheaval and change, forms and frames of reference have persisted, along with Iranians' tenacious sense of identity. The V&A has been collecting Iranian art as part of its wider Islamic collections since the 19th century. But it's only been over the last decade, in collaboration with the Iran Heritage Foundation, that the richness of the museum's Iranian holdings has been fully revealed. At the same time, the museum has been working with the Sarikhani collection, an exceptional private collection devoted to the art of Iran from all ages. From these collaborations, the idea to tell this untold story was born. Not least because until relatively recently, so much of that story lay undiscovered. John Curtis, the academic director of the Iran Heritage Foundation, is curator of the ancient section of the exhibition that starts in around 3000 BC.
Our knowledge of ancient Iran has been completely revolutionized in the last 60 years with a series of discoveries in different parts of the country. And some of these places have produced the most extraordinary things. On the west side of Iran, there's a number of small kingdoms and principalities dating from the period about 1200 BC onwards. This was the time when the people speaking Indo-Iranian languages actually came into Iran, and they established these centers. For example, there's one place called Malik, which is in the mountainous region just to the south of the Caspian Sea, and from cemeteries around Malik have been retrieved the most magnificent gold vessels with animal decoration on them, and most extraordinary terracotta bulls and figurines of naked women. If these discoveries had been made earlier, then the modern view of ancient Iran would be different. In the 1920s and 30s, when people were talking about the birth of civilization and the Fertile Crescent, Iran wasn't really included because these discoveries hadn't then been made, and it was regarded as rather the poor relation to Mesopotamia to the west. But we now know that this really isn't the case, and that it had a civilization really which was every bit as flourishing and prosperous as its neighbors.
Unlike treasures from the dawn of Iranian history, the ruined palaces of Persepolis and Susa have been known for centuries, as have many of the astonishing artifacts dating to the time of the great Persian Empire that flourished between 550 and 330 BC. But even so, a prejudice against Iran has persisted.
The thing one has to remember is that Iran has always had a very poor reputation in the West, and that is because of the accounts of Iran and Iranian rulers in the Greek authors who are writing about the Greco-Persian wars, and they represent the Persian kings as tyrants. And they have stories such as Xerxes lashing the waters of the Hellespont with whips when he's attempting to cross the water to get to mainland Greece.
This clay cylinder, covered in Babylonian cuneiform text, paints a very different picture, known as the Cyrus cylinder. After the Persian king Cyrus the Great, it was excavated in 1879 at the site of Babylon, the great city Cyrus conquered in 539 BC. The inscription sets out the remarkably tolerant terms of his rule.
First of all, Cyrus says that he occupied Babylon peacefully. In other words, he didn't destroy the city, as was normally the tradition at that time. The previous Assyrian and Babylonian kings, as soon as they captured a place, set fire to it and razed it to the ground. The second thing is, he says that he freed the inhabitants of Babylon from apparently what were forced labor obligations. So he abolished that. The third thing he says is that he's sending statues of gods back to the shrines from which they'd been removed by the Babylonian kings. And what this effectively means is that the inhabitants of that place can continue to worship those statues as they had done previously. The fourth thing is that he says he's sending deported peoples back to the places which they'd been forced to leave by the Babylonian kings. And he lists some of these peoples. He doesn't actually list the Jews, but we know that it was at this time that the Jewish people were able to go back to Jerusalem and to rebuild the Second Temple, because it says so in 3 different books of the Bible. And Cyrus is, of course, given the credit for sending the people back at this time.
If long-standing prejudices have colored our view of ancient Iran, surely the same can't be said of Persian art of the Islamic period. Tim Stanley, curator of the Islamic sections covering the arrival of the new faith in the 7th century right through to the 19th century, thinks that despite much admiration, there hasn't always been understanding.
Even in the treatment of the Islamic period, there have been enormous changes in the approach, so that when people looked at a manuscript illustration, they saw the illustration as a work of art isolated from its surrounding text in the book. And in fact, it was quite common to break up manuscripts in order to detach the illustrations from their context. Over the last few decades, especially since maybe the 70s, this approach has been abandoned, and we're much more interested in understanding the social, economic, and especially the literary contexts in which the art of Iran was produced. For example, in the exhibition, there's a carpet from the V&A collection, which was produced in the late 16th century, which has a very beautiful design, but the border includes 5 couplets from a lyric by Hafez. And Hafez was the greatest lyric poet of Iran who lived in the 14th century.
می خواه و گل افشان کن از دهر چه می جویی این گفت سحرگه گل بلبل تو چه می گویی Call for wine Scatter blossoms What more do you want from your time here At dawn, the rose spoke these words. Nightingale, what are you talking about?
The carpet has a design which incorporates both flowers and birds, but there's no way that the two things are connected directly. It's more that they're juxtaposed in an appropriate way, and we think that that's to do with the way that lyric poetry itself was constructed, because it consists of a series of images in discrete couplets which produce their effect by being juxtaposed rather than providing any sort of narrative. So that's a way that the exhibition tries to show how even the structure of poetry affects the way that art is produced.
We have to remember that poetry is at the heart and soul of every Iranian. Every Iranian can recite reams of poetry by heart. And so one hears it even as one is looking on an image, and it's even more exciting when one sees the interplay of poetry and image side by side.
Ina Sarikhani Sandmann is director of the Sarikhani collection and curator of the exhibition's modern and contemporary section. In gathering these works, she hopes to alter perceptions of present-day Iran.
I guess the fact that so few people have visited Iran, and it's an unknown place, and a place that often has very negative publicity in the headlines. What people might think is that Iran is a hostile, barren, iconoclastic, joyless place. And I think what we're trying to reveal in this exhibition is how dynamic, culturally rich, and varied Iran is, and presenting, particularly in the contemporary section, so many voices from women, which might surprise people. For example, looking at Mitra Tabrizian's work, you might think that it paints a picture of Iran as austere, joyless, alienated. And indeed, there is an aspect where Iranians who are today engaging with their own reality will want to express that. However, other works here show how dynamic and cultured it is. When you are having representations, for example, like Shirin Ali Abadi's Miss Hybrid, you see a girl who's just wanting to have fun. She's playing with her hair and makeup and being really defiant and reclaiming her own gaze in society.
There is no doubt that historically and in the present day, women in Iran have not been permitted the freedoms enjoyed by men.
It's really important to me as an Iranian woman to show how strong the female is as a presence in Iranian culture. Over half the artists in the modern and contemporary section are women, and you see that they are unafraid to express their many different voices, whether it's tackling issues of gender or politics, or else spiritual beings, such as the Shirazeh Hushiari sculpture. They are polyphonic, vibrant, and dynamic. And we see that in the ancient section. We see it in the representation of the woman in the Elamite couple, how powerful she is, how well dressed, holding her arm out, holding her bird to her chest, in the act of royal presence. I mean, really strong.
There are so many similar threads linking Iranian art and culture across the ages. But perhaps its greatest constant is change. Given Iran's natural wealth and importance as a trade route between East and West, it has been the subject of continual invasion and conquest. These objects, for example, were created by silversmiths working for the last rulers of ancient Iran, the Sasanians. In the 3rd to 7th centuries AD, their empire covered both Mesopotamia and Iran. And at Nakhsh Rustam, near Persepolis, a vast rock carving commemorates the victories of the Sasanian king Shapur I over the Roman emperors Philip the Arab and Valerian. Shapur, like all Sasanian kings, is recognizable by the bunches of curled hair at his shoulders and his crown, which bears a crescent moon or sun disk, both of which are associated with Ahura Mazda, the highest deity of the Sasanians' religion, Zoroastrianism. Another important symbol of kingship and the divine is the diadem.
A diadem is something which gets tied round a hat, and it's got long tassels at the back. And on many Sasanian scenes, you can see a diadem like this being given by Ahura Mazda to the Sasanian king. And one of the actually very splendid things in the exhibition, I think one of the most splendid for me, is a silk textile from Jouarre Abbey on the outskirts of Paris. Shows birds, probably pheasants, who have got halos around their heads. They're wearing round their necks one of these diadems ending in tassels, which is a symbol of kingship. And this particular silk is in brilliant colours, and it's known to have been in the collections of the Abbey before 1000 AD, which is really, really remarkable. So it could be very early Islamic period as well as being late Sasanian.
Arab Islamic conquerors brought Sasanian rule to an end in 651 AD. With them, they brought their faith to Iran, their sacred text, the Quran, as well as the Arabic language and the Arabic script. But this didn't mean that Iran's past was obliterated. Far from it. In the late 900s, an Iranian poet, Ferdowsi, created one of the greatest works of world literature, the Shahnameh, or Book of Kings. Although it used the Arabic script, it was written in Persian, and the story it told was based on tales of glorious deeds recounted in pre-Islamic Sasanian texts.
And what he did was, by creating a great poem about the history of Iran, he actually perpetuated the history of Iran so that people in the Middle Ages and in the early modern period in Iran knew very well what had happened in the country in the period before Islam. Of course, it isn't a history in a scientific sense. It's an epic, so it includes mythical elements that are drawn from Zoroastrianism. It includes legendary elements, but it also includes, especially in the later part, a good deal of history. And in fact, people use it as a historical source for the Sasanian period.
In the centuries after Ferdowsi created the Shahnameh, Iran fell subject to numerous foreign rulers, including the Seljuk Turks in the 11th century and the Mongols in the 13th. But the text remained important.
The Shahnameh, especially during the Mongol period, became very important because it was a memory of how the kings of all Iran should behave. And the Mongol rulers of Iran, because they weren't Muslim, they needed a source to justify their power. And they obviously saw the Shahnameh as one of these sources. But certainly from the 14th century onwards, it becomes a strong tradition in Iran that rulers would have illustrated copies of the Shahnameh, the Book of Kings, made for their own use. And so we have a whole series of really wonderful manuscripts that reflect the aspirations of the rulers of Iran to insert themselves into the history of the country in the way that the heroes of the Shahnameh had done in the past.
Among them is this battle scene from the early 16th century, depicting the Iranian commander Qaran unhorsing his enemy Barman.
This manuscript has to be a highlight in the exhibition. It is so detailed, showing two different warring nations against each other, a nighttime battle scene with the golden moon cascading over the beautiful turquoise land. What's interesting is when you look at them, every person is individuated, and it represents something of the multi-ethnicness of Iran as it is even today. You know, faces that may look Asian right down through to others that look far more Middle Eastern or even Caucasian.
A love of vibrant color is one of the great constants in Iranian art across the millennia. It can be found in the gleam of precious metals inlaid with the mineral wealth of Iran itself and its ancient dominions. Even where those inlays have been lost, we can imagine how dazzling they must once have been. And instead of seeing the remains of its palaces the same color as the landscape, we need to picture them as they would have been, painted with bold colors, or covered in glazed bricks. In Iranian architecture, this tradition of honoring important sites with color reached new heights in the Islamic age through the perfection of glazed tiles. These are celebrated in a room painted a brilliant turquoise of Persian tiles that evokes the soaring architecture of Esfahan.
A large number of buildings with this type of both internal and external tile work survive in Isfahan, which became the capital of Iran in 1598 under the later Safavids. So this had survived into the late 19th century. This was a key part of world architectural heritage, and that was of interest to the V&A, or the South Kensington Museum as it was called then. In the 1860s, the V&A began to collect casts of important monuments, including Michelangelo's David and Trajan's Column. But of course, a cast can't be used to capture the colour of an Isfahan mosque. Photography was used, but of course black and white photograph can't be used to catch the colour of an Isfahan mosque. So the third method that the V&A used is by having painted copies made of wall paintings in Italian churches, for example. And so we had 39 of these, some of them very enormous paintings, provided to the V&A in 1877. For 150 years they've been in our possession, and the Epic Iran exhibition gave us the opportunity to show these for the first time. And three of them are from the interior of domes in Isfahan, and they've been conserved and mounted in an extraordinary way so that you actually can look up, as you can here, and see them mounted as though they were in the original buildings.
Epic Iran has given the V&A the chance to show so many previously hidden treasures in its collection, and yet more may come to light. In Iran itself, new finds are continually being made that will add to our understanding of its ancient past. And of course, the contemporary arts will continue to flourish, come what may. It is a story all Iranians hope will unfold for millennia to come.
We do hope that through this exhibition, people understand what makes Iran epic. This is first of all the scale of the country itself, this wonderful mountainous plateau. It is also the longue durée of its culture, informing on itself century after century, right up until and continuing today. And of course, the epic hints at the narrative, the stories of the ancients who've been passed down through a language that's been used for nearly 4,000 years, the myths and legends of our ancient kings, and how they continue to be relevant today.